A recipe that we're often asked about is how to paint black armour. We've already covered this in one video with our How to Paint Sisters of Battle, and that was just using a paintbrush. In this video we're going to take a look at another recipe, and we're going to utilise the airbrush and the hairy brush to give us a different looking black. It's worth saying that in this video initially I was just making it purely to do how to paint black power armour, but I decided as I was painting the model he was clearly going to be a Black Templar, so I may as well show how to do the white on that as well. So if it seems like, oh, why on earth Henry painted all of the shoulder pads black and then decided to mask them off and paint them white, that's why. If I was starting the scheme from scratch, I wouldn't have bothered doing that. But let's get to it. Over a black primer, I'm going to give the whole model a couple of coats of Vallejo Game Air Black. This is so that if I do need to touch anything up later on, I've got a matching colour. I've thinned this maybe 1:1 with thinner. This is one of those air paints that's genuinely great, pretty much straight from the bottle. Just want to make sure I get all the nooks and crannies. Now for our first highlight, I'm going to use P3 Coal Black. I've thinned this quite a lot, as you can see on the paper, probably 2 or 3 drops of thinner to paint. I'm going to make sure I keep the highlights quite tight, so I don't want to cover too much of the area that I'm highlighting. This is one of the keys to painting black. So I pick my usual light source, just following the shapes and making a small highlight on each of them, making sure it's consistent. And for the highlight, I've added 5 drops of Ivory from Vallejo Model Colour to 1 drop of Coal Black. And this time I'm aiming for an even narrower area, so I'm using that previous highlight as a guide. This can be quite tricky initially, and often you're going to end up with a model that's grey, or in this case a sort of blue-grey, not black. But it will click, so stick with it. I've kept this mixture nice and thin, 3 or 4 drops of thinner to the paint, and I want to be able to build this highlight up in layers. You can see here, I'm just going back over some of the areas at the top, the ones that are going to catch the most light, just emphasise them. So to bring back some of that black colour, I'm going to give the whole model a couple of glazes with Vallejo Game Air Black. So I've heavily thinned this, probably 4 or 5 drops of thinner to paint. And I'm going to glaze all over the model, and then I'm just going to hit the shadows a couple of times. And this will just tone it down a little and bring it back so it's looking like a black model as opposed to a dark green or dark grey model. Black's one of those schemes where it will really come together when we can get some other colours onto the model as well. I give the whole model a couple of coats of Vallejo polyurethane gloss varnish. I normally spray it around 20 psi, so I tend to need to thin this about 2 drops of thinner to 1 drop of varnish to get a smooth coat. It's time for the pin wash. For this I'm going to use GW Contrast Black Templar. You might think, why on earth are you pin washing black onto a black model? As you can see, actually the model's quite a few different tones, so we want to make sure that the deepest, darkest recesses are as pure black as we can make them. I just really like using the GW Contrast paints to pin wash with. You could use an enamel, or you could use an oil paint if you'd rather. Now here's where I thought I'd best do a proper Black Templar recipe, seeing as it's only one other colour. So I've got a bit of masking putty, in this case from Ammo for MIG. This is camouflage masking putty. Really like it, it's worth getting if you can. And I'm going to base coat the pad with Coal Black. So we're not needing any more paints at this stage. Just want to get a smooth base coat of the Coal Black. And this is going to be the shadow. And I'm going to build up the highlight, or the white, using Tamiya flat white. I've thinned this, probably 3 to 4 drops of thinner to paint, because I want to build it up and get a really nice smooth gradient. Now, I had to keep referring back to the model to check what angle the arms were so I could get the highlight right. Obviously, on a traditional kit where the shoulder pads would be separate, this would be a lot easier to do. I really like using the shadow colour here, which was the highlight colour on the black. It's a nice consistency across the model. We need to pin wash the white. For this, I'm going to use an artist oil colour, PAYNE'S grey from Winsor & Newton. You can see it's this nice blue-grey colour. A little bit thin there. Tiny bit more paint. That's what we want. And I've given the whole shoulder pad a gloss coat with the polyurethane, just like I did with the black. We'll pin wash in the oil now. So this is also a really simple white recipe. I'm going to also be getting an awesome white recipe next week from Andy on a White Scars bike using completely different colours. Let's take the putty off. Looking pretty good. So now I've got the model together, I'm going to give it its final finish. For this I've chosen satin, and a mix I often use 4:1 matte to gloss. A couple of layers through the airbrush. Now to further highlight the armour, I'm going to take my coal black and I'm going to take my ivory, this time on my palette. I'm going to mix up a few tones and I'm going to use these to edge highlight with. This is very much an optional stage, but it does add a lot of punch. So you can see I've been focusing on those sharp edges, those that are going to catch and reflect the light. You might want to just save this for character models, or if it's only a small project, it's really a minimal investment in time for what's a significantly more interesting looking model. And we're not doing that classic edge highlighting all the way around. Now I go in with a slightly brighter mix, just much smaller highlights. Just picking out those areas. Just a real final bright one on the head. Quickly wipe off any mistakes. Looking pretty cool. As I said before, once we start to get some more colours on the model, the black will really start to pop. So for the silver, I'm going to base coat it using scale 75 black metal. To highlight, I've gone for GW Grey Knight Steel. This is a lighter colour, but it's also got a hint of blue to it. So we're keeping that overall sort of cold tone and feel to the model. Last part of the armour recipe is going to be what we use for the battle damage. And black can be quite tricky to get battle damage to look particularly impactful. But something like Rhinox Hide, a nice red-brown, works really quite nicely, particularly on this scheme where we've got this blue-green that's there already. And if we focus some of that battle damage on the edges, where it would naturally occur anyway, it shows up even more. But what really shows up on black armour is when you chip or battle damage using silvers. So I'm using GW Leadbelcher here, it's just a really nice thick paint. And you can see just the smallest amount really draws your eye. If you wanted, you could perhaps forget the earlier stages of edge highlighting and just perhaps use a little bit of this Leadbelcher to achieve not a dissimilar effect. And there we have it, a black Templar. With all the other details painted in, the black really begins to shine through, and I think it's a really cool looking model, and was a perfect scheme to try out on one of these assault intercessors. If you want to know how to paint the additional bits and bobs like the pouches and whatnot, check out something like the Ultramarines video or the Blood Angels video. We've given a couple of different recipes you can use in there. Thanks very much for watching, and if you've enjoyed the video, then hit the like button. To make sure you don't miss out on any others, hit subscribe as well, and I'll see you next time.